Hey, this is John Paul Mendoza with It's a Paul World. We're here at Freedom Fest 2020, and we've got Geoff Lawrence, the Reason Foundation. Geoff Lawrence is probably one of those guys. I mean, when you look at this guy, you would not know that he covers weed every single day. I mean, we're talking about the ganja, we're talking about the marijuana, we're talking about the stuff that everybody said would give you reefer madness, and he's here to give us an update on where we are in today's world. Geoff, thanks for spending some time with us. So talk about a little bit about what's the landscape today with cannabis and how everything is going today.
Yeah, sure. So, do I take this?
No.
Okay, all right.
I got you.
Okay.
You can just relax.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Governor said it's going to be okay.
So now, there's been a huge sea change in public opinion on cannabis. Latest Gallup polls show 68% of Americans approve of recreational, 90 plus medical, which over a 10-year time period, that's been flip-flop. And I think marijuana has become like the primary issue from a federalism standpoint in the country today, because now you have 18 states that have expressly bucked federal law by creating adult use programs, 36 states with medical programs, and in almost all of those cases, they were driven truly from the bottom up because they were put in place by initiative petitions, not by the legislature. It's only in about 4 cases now, and all of which is very recently, that state legislatures have gotten involved and started to craft their own legalization policies. So that's kind of where we're at on the state front, and I can get more into that if you want. But on the federal side, now we have 2 bills circulating in Congress, one in the House, one in the Senate, that would completely deschedule marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, so that it could be, you could have free commerce in it. The MORE Act is the bill in the House. The one that seems to have more legs right now, though, is the bill that Schumer just released in the Senate. And that bill it's a discussion draft. They're getting feedback on it. The industry itself doesn't seem to like the bill. There are a lot of things in it not to like. Tax rate starting out would be at 10% federal excise tax on top of what states and localities are already assessing, and it would move up to 25% over 5 years. So it's a pretty high rate. Makes legal marijuana kind of uncompetitive to illegal marijuana, and that bill would also require regulation by the FDA, which is kind of a non-starter for most companies.
Wow. Yeah, well, how do you screw something up? You let Congress kind of start working on it. So, I mean, if you think about it, let's say we're going to have excise tax on top of all the other confiscatory taxes that the localities are doing, and then we toss in the FDA. I mean, if we didn't have COVID-19, we would have never gotten the vaccine. Whether you're an anti-vax or not, when you're out there, okay, don't write to me about that shit. Okay, just don't worry about it. But, we would have never actually gotten that done in the period of time that we did. Now, whether you like it or you don't like it, we actually got it done, which actually shows that the FDA can move on something. But if you put this in there, and this thing could be, stuck for 5-7 years, I mean, you're going to just have to get some kind of high fiber, diet to get it through the system or something, So, okay, all right, well, that's interesting. So what do you think is do you think that we're going to continue to see more on the local level and it continue to move in that direction?
Yes. In fact, there are already initiatives that have been filed in a number of states looking ahead to the 2022 election. Ohio is probably going to have a very high-profile effort there. There have been several in Florida, but some have been thrown out in the courts already. But that seems to be an ongoing push, and there are donors who are willing to support it. Here in South Dakota, South Dakota was really controversial in the last election because they passed a constitutional amendment that would provide for both medical and recreational program. The governor and some of her allies challenged that initiative after the fact, after it passed, saying that it actually would require, it's not a constitutional amendment, it's actually a rewriting of the Constitution, which would require a totally different process. So it looks like the initiative is some version of initiative is going to come back here in South Dakota. 4 have already been filed. And so the sponsors are just they're waiting out the challenges to see which one is left standing at the end of the day, and then that'll be pushed again in 2022. So some form of legal market is likely materialized here in South Dakota, as most people already thought that it had.
Yeah. Well, and one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the banking system is really shut down to the entire cannabis industry. I mean, costs are through the roof on getting anything done in the cannabis industry. So I think that also creates a kind of a barrier not only to entry and then also the number of permits. So it appears that it is government in its worst form when cannabis is involved. I mean, it's like, okay, how many layers do we have? No, not enough. Let's add a few more. So do you see that lessening in any of the current areas that already have legalization? I mean, California, I know, has just a massive amount of regulations that make it really hard for people to come in. So there's limited competition, high prices. Do you see any of that changing, Geoff?
Yes, the financial question is an interesting one because it's actually not even in the interest of governments to do this. When you have banking records in a business, that creates an audit record that tax officials can go back and look and see if you paid the correct amount of taxes. In the cannabis industry, where you force everyone to do cash-based transactions, they can misrepresent what their gross revenue was and evade taxes. So the government doesn't win in this scenario, and yet the way FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has promulgated rules to deal with marijuana companies, it makes it virtually impossible to get a bank account. It's not illegal. You can offer a bank account to a marijuana company. It's just very expensive to comply with the FinCEN rules. You have to do reports on each individual transaction, and then also report in the aggregate and do ongoing due diligence in our customer for all of your clients. So it becomes a business decision by banks not to offer these accounts unless there are a handful of small community banks that decide to get in the business, but they charge, say, $2,000 to $3,000 a monthly fee just to keep the account open, plus a percentage of deposits, usually around 1% of deposits. So that gets, that eats into the company's margin, and also it's a pain for the bank to deal with themselves. But this is how they kind of compensate. If you can if you deschedule marijuana entirely, the way the FinCEN rules are written, it doesn't actually say marijuana. It just says Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. Right. So if you remove it from the schedule, then the banking issue solves itself immediately. If we don't get to that point, the next best alternative is something like the Safe Banking Act, which is moving through Congress now, although that's not a panacea because there would still be some additional FinCEN barriers for banks.
And talk a little bit about the safe banking, the legislation that may be moving through, and what is it trying to accomplish? Yeah,
so safe banking creates this new definition called legitimate marijuana business. And what that does is it allows banking regulators it requires them to set up new rules for banks that want to offer accounts to these businesses, verifying that all of their transactions took place on the state track and trace system, that they're properly licensed, et cetera. And this would allow banks to be able to offer these accounts on a more cost competitive basis. They still would not be able to do things like provide an inventory line of credit, for instance, because that would be seen as aiding and abetting a federal crime. But what Safe Banking Act does primarily is it prevents federal banking regulators from discriminating against banks who offer these accounts.
And for those of you who are not aware of this, because it's one of those business things in the weeds, most people don't know about it, is that if you walk into any bank in the United States and say, I want to open up a cannabis business, or I have a cannabis business and I want to do that, you go to any major bank, it's a no. It's a total no. If in fact you get really clever, and anybody who's listening to this gets really clever, and what you decide is the really cool thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to tell them that. I'm going to put in some kind of euphemism or something like that. And if you do that, again, I'm not a lawyer. Geoff, you're not a lawyer?
No.
Okay, well, neither of us are lawyers. So I'm going to give you street advice. If you go and lie on banking forms to get that, you commit a federal crime. Remember, very, very little. I think nothing is worth committing a federal crime, especially some process crime like this, because they will rip you to shreds, and they can because you've just opened the door for them. So don't ever do that. Let's talk about some of the other issues, which are zoning and some of those local issues, which seem to be very onerous. I mean, I've been looked at, and I invested in a company, and no longer an investor in this. Talk to me about some of the local issues that you probably have seen as you've studied the marketplace.
Yeah, so it varies a lot by state. So some states will require a city to affirmatively opt into a state marijuana program if they want to allow licensees within the jurisdiction, right? So California is an example of a place where local governments can opt out entirely. And in fact, 80% of the local governments in California have said, we're not going to allow dispensaries. So, in 4/5 of the state, there's really no access, even though there is a legal market. And in some parts of the state, a person would have to drive more than 100 miles to get to a legal dispensary because it's a big state, right? So, that's been a point of contention between state lawmakers and localities. And so what the regulators have done is they've said, okay, you can disallow a dispensary, but we're still going to force you to accept deliveries, home deliveries from dispensaries, even if they're remote. That way people have access and they're not driving a long way under the influence. We see this as a safety issue, and so the League of Cities sued the state, and the lawsuit is now ongoing. But just kind of, that's just one example that really highlights the fact that a lot of local governments don't want to have anything to do with marijuana, whereas others like it, that they see it as an opportunity to get additional tax revenue. In California, Desert Hot Springs is an example of a place that's really gone all in. And Michigan, Bay City, Michigan, has been kind of the capital of cannabis because they didn't have much of a tax base before. Now they think they have an opportunity to gain a tax base because other local governments aren't opting in.
Right. So, look down the road. What do you think? Get your crystal ball. 5, 10 years, are we going to see not just changing it and descheduling it? When do you think we're going to actually see first decriminalization and then legalization at the federal level? Is that still in the offing? Because I can tell you, and I can just sense that there's an age differential between us, that years ago when the guys at Normal kicked off, and I think I threw $20 into a jar at some point in time, way back when, and everybody said, 2-3 years tops, this thing is all going to be all settled. Well, that was decades ago. I had brown hair. I was a lot thinner. So tell me, what are we looking at for deschedule, criminalization, legalization?
That's a $10 million question. I think any libertarian knows that the more laws you have on the books, the more opportunities you have to harass people you don't like, right? So politicians like having these, this ongoing drug war because it creates those opportunities. And there's not a lot of indication that's really going to change. It looks like there are some lawmakers in the Senate and the House that want to get credit for putting a bill forward, right, while also putting enough poison pills in those bills to ensure that they won't pass. Then at the same time, we saw during this past week, the Senate bill was introduced. An hour later, Jen Psaki is giving a press conference at the White House and reiterates the president's position that under no way is he going to sign a legalization bill. He supports decriminalization, not legalization. So, based on her words, you have to assume that it's not going to be during this presidency, maybe during the next one.
Excellent. Any last thoughts, Geoff, before we wrap up?
Be safe. Marijuana is can be a very good product for adults. It can have some medical benefits depending on your condition, but it is a product that needs to be used responsibly. And it can be damaging for children, so keep your inventory safe.
So don't assume just because you've always wanted it to be legal or you wanted to be able to get to it and get access to it, that this is something that you can just express and use without any consequence. Everything has a consequence. Make a personal, rational choice, which is what libertarians should be doing, and you live with the consequence of those actions. And I think what you're saying, if I hear you right, is that just be safe and do that.
That's right. Tell people to enjoy alcohol responsibly. Do the same thing with marijuana.
Excellent. And on that note, I just want to thank Geoff Lawrence of the Reason Foundation. He's been spending some time with us today talking about cannabis, the changing landscape, and what's going on. It's been a very gracious guest. Geoff, thanks a lot for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on.